He is currently professor at Georgetown University, and he's director in the Center for Peace and Security Studies of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. Paul Pillar, welcome.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. As another one of those Washington refugees fleeing the snow, I am delighted to be able to come to Maine in February to thaw out and dry out. I'm going to address the rationales and impact of the U.S. military expedition in Afghanistan. And by that, I mean my subject is the fundamental question of why are we there at all, and how did we get there? I'm going to give you a very specific point of view on this. It's going to be a point of view that is sharply focused on U.S. interests, and it's a point of view that is partly shaped by another part of my background, which is as a former counter-terrorist official. So Afghanistan is the topic. 12 years ago was the first direct application of U.S. military force in Afghanistan, a strike with cruise missiles ordered by the Clinton administration against a camp associated with Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda organization in response to that group's attack on 2 U.S. embassies in Africa. On the morning of the missile strike, I had the task of going to the Capitol and briefing the Congressional Intelligence Committees on the underlying intelligence about al-Qaeda's terrorist activities, what they were doing at that camp and other things in Afghanistan, and what was the nature of their relationship with the Afghan Taliban. After the George W. Bush administration came into office, its focus as far as policy on Afghanistan was concerned was also bin Laden, and specifically how the Taliban might be convinced to end its hospitality for him and his group. The delicacies observed in those days, and in retrospect, doesn't that cruise missile strike seem like a pinprick? Those delicacies were swept aside by the drastic change in the American public mood caused by the terrorist attack in September 2001, after which the United States intervened in what became known as Operation Enduring Freedom in an ongoing Afghan civil war. The intervention quickly succeeded in ousting the Taliban from power over most of Afghanistan and rousted al-Qaeda from its Afghan haven. It is impossible to understand how we got to where we are today without reference to that history, and specifically to the association of Afghanistan in American minds and discourse with terrorism, to the overpowering impact of 9/11 on American emotions and politics, to the disquieting sense that the United States had prematurely turned away from Afghanistan after assisting Mujahideen and pushing the Soviets out during the 1980s. And most of all, to the fact that, given our intervention in the fall of 2001, we were already there. Another important bit of politics and history is the Bush administration's expedition in Iraq, which our current president, to his credit, in my judgment, opposed from the beginning. This made Afghanistan, in contrast, the so-called good war, and the theater in which President Obama and his administration and his party would demonstrate their counter-terrorist bona fides and ward off their opponents' incessant efforts to portray them as wimps on national security. This historical and political context is what makes waging a costly counterinsurgency in Afghanistan comprehensible. It cannot be comprehended in terms of a dispassionate analysis of U.S. national interests. The single most consistently cited rationale for the counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, and you saw it as the core goal in one of Larry's slides representing official U.S. policy for why we're there, is that it is a key part of the fight against al-Qaeda and a means of protecting the American people against terrorism by preventing al-Qaeda from reestablishing the sort of safe haven it had in Afghanistan at the time of 9/11. Now, the first problem with that is al-Qaeda isn't even in Afghanistan, except National Security Advisor Jones tells us for fewer than 100 members. So we have adopted, as a kind of surrogate enemy, the Afghan Taliban. The surrogacy might seem to make sense, given that the Taliban clearly have shared an extreme ideology and a past close alliance with al-Qaeda. But the Taliban are not a transnational terrorist group. Their goals are not bin Laden's goals. They are one of the most insular bands ever to get international attention. They care about the political and social order in Afghanistan. They do not care about the United States, except insofar as the United States gets in the way of their aspirations for the internal ordering of Afghanistan. Afghans in general, by the way, despite how much we have come to associate their country with international terrorism, are actually relatively scarce in the ranks of international terrorists, notwithstanding the occasional exception, such as Najibullah Zassi, the young man who became radicalized, not in some camp in South Asia, but during his days selling coffee and pastries from a cart in Lower Manhattan. If the Taliban were to return to power over most of Afghanistan, they would, in my judgment, see little or no advantage in once again hosting a significant presence of bin Laden's al-Qaeda. Their previous playing of host, after all, led directly after 9/11 to the biggest setback the Taliban ever suffered. Bin Laden and his partner, Ayman al-Zawahiri, also would see little advantage in restoring the previous arrangement. They have successfully stayed hidden in northwest Pakistan for nearly a decade now, and any attempt to rebuild anything like what al-Qaeda previously had in Afghanistan would quickly expose the group, not just to pinpricks this time, but instead to the sort of uninhibited US firepower that American public outrage after 9/11 unleashed, and which would still be in play even if US troops were not on the ground. And even if, despite this disincentive, al-Qaeda were to try to rebuild something like that earlier presence, it would make little difference to the terrorist threat that confronts Americans. The policy issue regarding Afghanistan is not whether terrorist groups make use of safe havens. If available, they do. The issue is not even whether the use of such a haven helps the group. It does. The issue instead is whether the use of this haven by this group would make it so much more of a threat, over and above the threat that it would pose anyway, to warrant the expenditure of blood and treasure required by a counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. One consideration I already mentioned, the lack of attractiveness of an Afghan haven relative to the one in northwest Pakistan that bin Laden's group already enjoys, suggests that it does not. Another consideration is the availability of other possible havens, should the group need and want one, such as Yemen, Somalia. Those are the ones that are most often mentioned. There's no shortage of such places, and the United States clearly does not have the resources to try to pacify them all. Yet another consideration is that, as 9/11 itself demonstrated, most of the preparations for terrorist attacks that most endanger Americans take place not in territorial havens, but instead in scattered locations elsewhere, chiefly in the West. In the case of 9/11, it was in Spain, in Germany, mostly right here in the United States. Other assets of a group, in particular, ideological appeal and a ready supply of already radicalized recruits, is much more important than a piece of acreage. Still another consideration is that the Sunni Salafi terrorist threat that has become increasingly diffuse in a way that lessens any organizational reliance on a particular command structure in South Asia. A reminder of this was that attempted bombing on Christmas Day of a Detroit-bound airliner, which received so much attention. The would-be bomber was a Nigerian, radicalized while a student in the United Kingdom, further influenced by an extremist imam in Yemen who had spent half his life in the United States. And so far as we know, the group that outfitted Abdul Muttalib with his explosive underwear, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, was not taking orders from anyone hiding in the hinterland of South Asia. This was another one of those groups that has adopted the Al-Qaeda brand name, but is not being directed or ordered or financed by bin Laden and Zawahiri. The operation had nothing to do with Afghanistan. Now, as for the counterinsurgency itself, Larry Goodson has expertly covered most of this, and I'm just going to make the following 3 points. That's the famous manual, by the way. One is to express confidence in our commanders and the brave troops under their command that they're going to make the best of a very difficult situation. The second is that the situation is very difficult indeed, in ways that ought to make us pessimistic against the standards of established counterinsurgency doctrine. One of the reasons is that weakness of the national DNA that Whitney Ezoy described so expertly this morning. Another is, and we've seen numerous references to this, the corruption and wide perception of illegitimacy on the part of the central government. Another is that the forces available may simply be not sufficient, and that was a question addressed earlier to Larry, and I'd agree with his answer, given the magnitude of the task. The time available is very likely to be insufficient, given the administration's timetable of beginning to ramp down the U.S. presence barely a year after it was ramped up. Even if our resourceful forces manage, and this is my third basic point about the counterinsurgency, manage despite these challenges to stabilize most of Afghanistan, this will buy the American people little or nothing in the way of increased security. And this is for the reasons I already mentioned with regard to safe havens and what they mean. I'll add one more reason, which is that even if General McChrystal's strategy succeeds completely, that will mean stabilizing and securing only part of Afghanistan, leaving ample room for someone to establish a safe haven if that's what we're really worried about. And General McChrystal's strategy, going back to that leaked document, makes this quite clear. Meanwhile, the counterproductive aspects of applying U.S. military power in Afghanistan also have become all too apparent. Foreign military occupation has helped to unite, motivate, and win support for the disparate elements that we have come to label the Afghan Taliban. The occupation and inevitable collateral damage and civilian casualties have drained much of what had been, remarkably so for a predominantly Muslim country, a reservoir of goodwill toward the United States, and have stimulated more Afghans to take up arms against coalition forces. We read about such incidents week after week. The most recent one in the Marja offensive we heard about a week ago, about a dozen people killed when there was an errant missile, most of them women and children. One of the results has been seen in some public opinion polls. This is the product of a consortium of news organizations that have asked the basic questions of favorable or unfavorable attitudes toward the United States at various intervals. The trend's pretty clear. I should hasten to add that the same consortium did come out with a further result just in the last fortnight that didn't make it onto this slide, which shows a slight uptick, which is very encouraging. But the trend, as I say, is not. Many of those who have joined the fight against U.S. and allied forces in Afghanistan really have no sympathy for the Taliban's ideology and do not even warrant the label Taliban. They are best described as angry and frustrated Afghans. The weakness of the rationale for pressing the fight in Afghanistan has led many supporters of that fight to say, well, our real concern is next door in Pakistan. There's a lot of commentary which embodies visions of mad mullahs getting their hands on those Pakistani nuclear weapons. The visions get tossed about, but without any explanation of exactly how events in Afghanistan would influence the future of Pakistan. Generally, instability can spill over a border like this for one of two reasons. Either it brings more resources to bear on the conflict in the second country, or it provides a base of operations, another kind of safe haven. Well, in this case, neither of those, in my analysis, seems to be, would be a major factor or even a significant one in governing events in Pakistan. A Taliban victory in Afghanistan would not bring any significant new resources to bear on the conflict in Pakistan, which has a population 5 times as large and an economy 10 times as large as Afghanistan. Nor would it offer Pakistani militants a safe haven any more attractive or useful than the one they already have in Pakistan's own federally administered tribal areas, the brownish area on the map. Pakistani officials themselves offer what might be the most authoritative take on how, if at all, US military operations in Afghanistan affect security challenges within their own country, particularly as it relates to the Pakistani Taliban, as well as those other sources of trouble and mischief we heard about earlier, away from the Fatah and into the settled areas. The Pakistanis have expressed concern that to the degree those operations, US military operations in Afghanistan, are successful, they will merely push militants across the Durand Line, just as bin Laden and his colleagues were pushed across 8 years ago. And another factor is that the unpopularity among most Pakistanis of just about any US military operation in the nearby region also limits Islamabad's political ability to cooperate with the United States in pursuing Washington's objectives, including counter-terrorist objectives, or at least to be seen doing so, which, if nothing else, is an inhibition and a complication. Then there is what Pakistani officials do not acknowledge: their continued relationship with the Afghan Taliban, which they distinguish from the Pakistani Taliban and see not as a threat, but instead as an asset and a form of insurance against the political uncertainty of Afghanistan itself. And as we've heard in previous talks, this is, in their context, Afghanistan, that it is part of their strategic depth in confronting India. And this presents perhaps the ultimate irony of the United States war in Afghanistan, that the government we are supposedly trying to save from spreading instability, that is to say, the status quo in Pakistan, is itself doing business with the principal enemy we are fighting. And by the way, my observations about the most recent capture of this Afghan Taliban leader that was reported a couple of weeks ago conform pretty much with what Ahmed Rashid said last night in his commenting on that capture. There's one more rationale one often hears for pursuing the counterinsurgency, and that is that to back down from our existing commitment there, precisely because it is an existing commitment, and no matter how peripheral it might otherwise be to core US interests, that this would severely damage US credibility, disillusioning our friends and encouraging our adversaries. This, I might observe, is, and it's somewhat pertinent to the last question that was posed to Larry in the last hour, this is strikingly reminiscent of the chief rationale for the war in which I served as an Army officer, namely the one in Vietnam. The underlying assumption was as unexamined and as invalid then as it is now. Look at the way we regard, or we would regard, some other government in pulling back from either a losing hand or proposition, or pulling back from costly endeavors that were not vital for our core interest. Would we question that same government's determination to stand up for things that were important to it and did have to do with its core interest in the future? No, of course we wouldn't. We would consider each interest on its own. And that's not the way other governments interpret our behavior either. It's simply not the way either we would assess the willingness of other governments to stand up for the most important interest. It's not how others assess ours. And I would commend some academic research on this, by the way, by Professor Darrell Press of Dartmouth, particularly in a book, if I remember the title, called Calculating Credibility. Let me close on this thought. One of the most admirable qualities of Americans is their determination to see their undertakings, especially foreign wars, through to successful achievement of American goals, whatever may have been the reason for positing those goals. We are seeing some of that admirable quality today in Afghanistan and in the way that our troops there are carrying the fight forward, which admittedly makes the kinds of downbeat observations you're getting from me rather depressing. And they also don't advance Nick Burns' stated objective of making us feel better by Sunday afternoon. But that is my honest assessment. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time and look forward to questions.